just get started now.
Give it like a countdown, a few seconds, and then all right, we can go ahead and get going. But yeah, all right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. We're here covering the Akashathon here with Scott Carruthers from Overclock Labs, the Akash Director of Technical Support. We're going to get into some really cool stuff today. And the community out there, this is a huge opportunity to get engaged with Akash with some really cool tech with the experts in the industry right now. Plus, there's a huge prize pool available. So I'll hand it up to over to Scott if you want to kick us off here and get this workshop going.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. So first, I think probably a lot of participants in the audience are familiar with me, but just a quick background. I have my title as Director of Technical Support at Akash. Actually wear many hats at Akash. So originally I came into the organization as the Director of Technical Support. I've actually now moved into a more developer-focused role. So a lot of DevOps and contributions to our core code base. So definitely looking forward to any questions from the community. I definitely can. I've been now with Akash and working on the project I've been officially a core team member for about 2.5 years, and I've been working on Akash for probably the last 3.5 years. So could probably definitely answer most questions, whether those are architectural or even like getting into a code level or anything DevOps related. So going to use a majority of the time today just to showcase for those that aren't familiar with the Akash network, a demonstration of deploying an application onto Akash. And again, either at the end or certainly throughout the presentation, if anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in at any time. Happy to answer anything as we're going along as well. So with that, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, and Trevor, could you just give me an audible confirmation when you're able to see my screen, which is showing the Akash console?
I see it. Good to go.
Okay, great. So as I said, I want to go through a demonstration of deploying an application on the Akash's decentralized network. Before getting started with an actual deployment, I think it's helpful to ensure that everyone is aware of the Akash topology and what makes up the Akash network. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'll quickly transition into a demonstration of again, deploying an application on the Akash network. What we're currently looking at is a application called the Akash console. And this is the most popular deployment tool for the Akash network today. So for those that are DevOps or developers within the audience, we're looking at a GUI, a graphical interface to deploy onto the Akash network. Anything I'm showing today, you can also do via the Akash CLI. If you're more familiar and prefer to work from a CLI, you can definitely do everything I'm going to show today from the CLI. And also anything I'm showing today, you could do programmatically as well. So if you're developing your own platform, we have a lot of ecosystem partners that want to develop on top of the Akash network. So if you want to create application deployments onto the Akash network, you can certainly do that programmatically as well. But as you can appreciate, for the sake of demonstration, and since this is our most popular deployment tool today, I'm going to demo initially and primarily in this demonstration via the GUI Akash console. So as I said, before actually getting into the mechanics of creating and launching a application on the Akash decentralized network, I want to go over the topology of the Akash network. So as you can see in the Akash console, I'm currently in the provider tab, and the provider tab gives us some initial exposure to that Akash network topology. So to be clear, the Akash network is a decentralized compute platform, but the Akash network, or Overclock, the company that I work for, Overclock Labs, who are the creators of the Akash network, we don't run our own providers. We are the creators of the Akash decentralized network, which takes transactions onto our blockchain, and then we expose compute from self-sovereign providers. So in Akash nomenclature, a Akash provider is a independent self-sovereign provider of compute. So these self-sovereign providers could be large data centers. We certainly have many of those on the network today. So as cloud computing has evolved and large data centers have evolved, there started to become a realization that a majority of the compute within these data centers is underutilized or unutilized. So there's statistics that in large data centers, at any point in time, 90% of the compute in that data center may be unoccupied or unutilized. So the Akash network gives data centers the ability to launch their own Akash provider. Again, this isn't something that Overclock or Akash controls. This is a self-sovereign provider and a data center who's made a decision that they want to monetize their underutilized compute. So if we look at the providers on this tab, and you can see that we currently have 80 active providers on our mainnet blockchain network. So we have 80 active providers. You can see a representation, the geography of where these providers are dispersed. So as you can see, we, and probably as expected, we have very large presence in the United States. We also have a very large presence in Western and Central Europe. And also we have a lot of emerging momentum in provider activity in Asia. So obviously this is something that we're continuing to try to build out into more geolocations. I think there's been periods of time where we've had some providers in South America and Africa as well, obviously to get the compute closest to users of applications and deployers. We obviously want to, we're very much in our infancy and we're rapidly progressing. We expect these numbers of providers to increase tremendously over the upcoming year. And obviously, as those numbers increase, we expect some of these current dark geolocations to start to have a tremendous presence as well. But even with the current state of the network, very large data centers providing in the US, Europe, and Asia, we definitely have a pretty good starting point for geolocations of these different providers. Now, I've said several times that a lot of these providers on the network are data centers. That certainly are not the only providers of compute on the Akash network, and that's certainly not our vision or our philosophy for the Akash network. Certainly, we greatly appreciate and encourage large providers coming onto the network or large data centers coming onto the network, but it also goes down from there. So we also have individual users that have servers sitting in their home lab that realize that those are mostly underutilized or unutilized. So individuals can also become an Akash provider and put their resources onto the network. And then we also have everything in the expanse between large data centers and end users. So we have, like businesses that realize that they have underutilized resources in their own local data center. So really we go all the way from large data centers all the way down to individuals, and really the expanse of Akash providers runs the gamut in between. So this is the initial view of the Akash network, and we have 80 current active providers. If we were to go down on this page a little bit, and as we hide the geolocations and start to get into some more of the granular, and I won't get into this in depth, but we can start to see the amount of resources on the Akash network currently, and we can also see individual listing of these individual providers. So if I was just to highlight one of these, D3 Akash. So again, these are not providers that Akash is controlling. These are all self-sovereign providers that are building an Akash provider and are putting them onto the network. And obviously the mechanics of becoming an Akash provider is well documented. I'll share later our documentation site. So if you have some interest in becoming an Akash provider, we have excellent documentation. We also have ecosystem partners, one of them being an application called the Prater application, which makes it very easy to become an Akash provider. So if you're an individual and you have some available compute. We have some processes and procedures and documentation and ecosystem partners that make it very easy to become an Akash provider on the network. So as you can see, one of our current focuses with the current popularity and momentum in the AI space, we introduced the GPU marketplace back in August of 2023. So still less than a year old, this GPU marketplace, but this is really the most dynamic part of the network currently. So just like general compute, data centers realizing that they have underutilized CPU and memory and storage. These data centers are also realizing that they have very expensive NVIDIA A100s and H100s and other GPU chipsets that are sitting in their data center, very underutilized. So we now have a GPU marketplace that allows a provider to bring those GPU resources onto the network. And again, this is really the most dynamic part of the network right now and the most probably exciting part of the network. We now have AI developers doing foundational model training on the Akash network. And also, for those that are familiar with AI models, also, there's a lot of momentum on the Akash network currently of people doing inference AI workloads. So not necessarily training. As I said, we also have AI developers doing training of GPU model or AI models on the Akash network. But we also have, for already trained models, people coming in and doing LLM, large language models, and other types of inference on the Akash network as well. So you can run like your own intelligent chat app or something of that nature on the Akash network. So again, very dynamic and very emerging marketplace. Think if we went back maybe just a few weeks ago, the GPU counts on the Akash network were probably only like 25% of what they are today. So we have tremendous growth in both supply and demand in the GPU marketplace. So again, kind of just level setting before I actually go through a demonstration of creating and launching a deployment or application on the Akash network. I just wanted to make this topology very clear. So the Akash network is a network of decentralized compute, and these are all self-sovereign providers that are able to monetize their underutilized compute by bringing them onto the Akash network. So really, Akash, and you'll see this as I go through the deployment process of an application, Akash provides the blockchain, and that blockchain, as we go through the demonstration, you'll see as we create deployments and we create leases with these individual providers, Akash provides a blockchain where all these transactions are written to. So if you're a developer or a deployer and you're launching something on the Akash network, the blockchain will take all those transactions and do the accounting for the network. So the topology of the Akash network is that Akash blockchain that takes all those transactions. And then we have this network of self-sovereign providers that are actually providing the compute on the network. And as you can see, even if you were to go into the Akash console and had interest in becoming an Akash provider, we have a link. I won't go into that today, but a link, readily available link, so that you can begin your journey in becoming an Akash provider if you have underutilized compute that you'd like to monetize. So with that and the topology of the network in mind, I'm now going to go through a demonstration of a deployment onto the Akash network. And I'm going to try to interweave the deployment process with the topology that I just spent a few minutes describing. So in other words, as I'm going through the process of deploying an application of the Akash network, I'll try to make the topology even more clear as we go through the mechanics of launching a deployment onto a specific Akash provider. So as you can see, if you were to go into the Akash console and you want to launch a application onto the network utilizing the Akash console, you could go in, and if you have a ready to use template for an application, now I'll just briefly go into this. If you were to go in and you had a application that had a containerized image, you could go in and create your own template. And this template, for those that are involved in DevOps, is very heavily borrowed from Docker Compose YAML structure. And I know some in the audience are familiar with that and some that aren't. I'm not going to get into the mechanics and the specifics behind what we call an Akash SDL, which is a service description language, which is the recipe for deploying an application onto the Akash network. So if you had your own application that you were deploying, you could go in and build your own SDL to launch an application. But instead of doing that, I'm just going to go back and I'm going to instead deploy using a predefined template. So for those that aren't developers, those that aren't DevOps focused and don't have a lot of knowledge in that area, you can come onto the Akash console and utilize something from what we call Awesome Akash. And Awesome Akash is a library of pre-developed SDLs and predefined application templates, so that you can very easily and very readily deploy something like a WordPress site. So if you own a business and you're interested in creating a front-end web application, you could deploy a WordPress site onto the Akash network, and you don't really need to have any knowledge of that SDL that I talked about or anything of that nature. You can just come in and utilize a wealth of predefined templates that are part of this Awesome Akash repository that are exposed via the Akash console. So if I go in and I search through this marketplace, which again is backed by the Awesome Akash repository, you can see that there's a number of very interesting ready-to-go applications that I could deploy onto Akash. So I mentioned previously, with the emergence of AI and our GPU marketplace, we could come in and deploy a chat app using a LLM model. So again, you don't really even necessarily need to be overly familiar with the code that make up these models, or really don't need to be all that knowledgeable about the Akash SDL. You can just very easily come in and select one of these models, and for like Comfy UI, very easily deploy a AI application with very little pre-existing knowledge. So we could deploy something like that in our demonstration. We could deploy an AI workload. We also have a Cosmos SDK-based blockchain. We also have a lot of interest in deploying Cosmos RPC nodes and validators and things like that. So we could also go through a demonstration of deploying like a Akash RPC node or something of that nature. But I'm just going to use a funner example for our demonstration. So if I come into games, there's also a number of video games that we could deploy onto the Akash network. So for any of those that are familiar with front-end web application development, if I go into, and this is the one I'll use for our demonstration, if I go into Super Mario and want to deploy a Super Mario video game onto the Akash network, I can come into this. And if I just briefly look at that SDL, for any of those that are familiar with front-end development, and I said I'm not going to deep dive into the components of an Akash SDL, but just covering a couple of key components. We're deploying these applications onto those self-sovereign providers that I described earlier are running their own Kubernetes clusters. So since this is Kubernetes based, when we launch an application onto the Akash network, we're deploying essentially a Docker image or a container image onto the network. So if you're interested or familiar with front-end web app development, essentially the Super Mario app is just a React app that is written and then containerized. And now that it's been containerized, anybody can use it very easily on the Akash network. So the only components of this SDL that I'll get into is, first of all, we're deploying a container image onto the network. And then also the other components of the SDL that you would expect to find are the compute resources that I want to use for this specific deployment. So if I'm deploying this Super Mario video game onto the Akash network, I'm defining that I want my application to have access to a single CPU. So obviously I could throw 10 CPUs or 5 CPUs at this, or whatever would be appropriate for the application. And I can also define how much memory and storage I want to make available to my container or my application that is going to run on the Akash network. So if I get out of that and get back to the deployment process, we went into the Akash console, we went to a template that's available in Awesome Akash and these ready-to-use applications. And now I'm just going to go through the process of deployment. So when I initially state that I want to create a deployment. It again is going to expose the SDL that I just covered. But for all intents and purposes for this demonstration, we can just kind of next through this. We don't really need to focus any further on the SDL. We're just going to move forward and create a deployment. And also just to make sure that everyone in the audience were on the same page with nomenclature. When I said that I'm going to create a deployment on the Akash network, essentially the mechanics behind that is I am a application developer, or I'm a user that wants to launch a application on the Akash network. When I say deployment and I want to create a deployment, this is essentially going to create this Super Mario deployment, the Super Mario application deployment. And when I create the deployment, it's going to place an order onto the Akash blockchain. When that order gets placed on the Akash blockchain, that's then going to give the opportunity of that network, that entire expanse of self-sovereign providers, the ability to bid on that order. And we'll see that in action as we go forward in the deployment. But I just wanted to level set when we talk about creating a deployment, we're essentially creating a application-specific order onto the Akash blockchain, which will then allow that network of providers to then bid. And we'll see those mechanics as we move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and with Super Mario SDL selected, I'm going to go ahead and create the deployment. Now, again, we're utilizing the Akash blockchain for the deployment of this application. And this is kind of our first evidence of that interaction with the blockchain. So I'm going to create a deployment, and I need to put in, as I create the deployment, I need to put into what we call an escrow account, a amount of AKT, which is Akash's native token. We're going to place a certain amount of AKT into an escrow account. That escrow account is then going to be used by the selected provider to then withdraw funds over time. So as the Super Mario application is sitting on the Akash network and is sitting on a specific provider, this funds in escrow is a way for that provider to, over time, as you're consuming CPUs and GPUs and memory and storage, this is the mechanism of payment to that selected provider. And we'll see a little bit more of that eventually as well. I'm just going to go ahead and select the default here and say that I want to put 0.05, which is the minimum to create an application currently. That's the current minimum for an escrow account. So I'm just going to select that default, and I'm going to place, and as we can see, I'm connected via Kepler wallet here. So it's taking 0.5 AKT out of my connected Kepler wallet, and it's going to put those funds in escrow. When I go forward and actually create the deployment, again, this is some interaction with the blockchain in the first transaction that we encounter. So again, if we think about the topology that I described earlier, and we think about the process of creating a deployment onto Akash, I first need to create a transaction, which is going to place this deployment on the Akash blockchain. So as I accept these, again, as we see, we're connected to my Clipper wallet, and currently this transaction is going to create a deployment transaction onto the Akash network. So I'm going to go ahead and approve those fees, and now I'm interacting with the blockchain, and a blockchain transaction is being written. And really, in my opinion, the most interesting part of the deployment process is this current stage. And this is why I really wanted to cover that topology and the makeup of the Akash network before going into a demonstration, because what we're now seeing is this open marketplace. All these self-sovereign independent providers have now received that deployment. That deployment ended up on the Akash blockchain. We have an order for a deployment on the Akash blockchain. All of the providers on the network are constantly listening for new orders that are placed onto the network. When they saw this new order placed onto the network, they can now bid on that deployment. So as you can see, we are from these self-sovereign providers, we're getting a number of different price points. This isn't anything that the Akash network controls. This is the mechanics of an Akash provider, and this is open marketplace. We're not dictating the price. Those self-sovereign providers are dictating their own prices. So based on the fact that I wanted one CPU for this deployment, and I wanted a certain amount of RAM, and I wanted a certain amount of storage, all these independent providers have their own pricing mechanisms. And this is the price based on what they dictated. These are the prices that are derived from that specific order and for that specific deployment. So you could obviously go through a decision process of like what provider I want to select here. I could simply go with the cheapest provider. And we can also see some things that might guide your decisions, like which of these providers are audited. So an audited status means that it's a provider that has been audited by the Overclock team. So we've gone into this provider and made sure that they have stable uptime and that the attributes that they're advertising onto the network for like region and maybe network speeds and different things like that. We've gone in and sanity checked those providers. So possibly as part of your decision-making process of where I want to deploy my application across this topology of independent providers, maybe I go for the lowest price. Maybe I go for the lowest price that is also audited, or maybe I want to go with a provider that I'm very familiar with and have had great experiences with in the past. And that's kind of what the path that I'm going to go. One of our actually, I'm not getting I was going to say I was going to go with a provider that I'm very familiar with, which is named Europlots, but it looks like that provider is actually, so they, again, self-sovereign providers, they have the ability to bid on a deployment or not. It looks like the provider that I was going to select actually decided not to bid. Maybe they're based on a rather low amount of resources, like only one CPU and very minimal RAM and storage. They're choosing not to bid on those kind of minimal workloads. So I'll just go ahead. This is a provider called Foundry Staking, which is a large data center. So even though it's the most expensive of my list, maybe I make the decision that I want to go with that provider because I know that they're very stable. It's a enterprise data center. So I'm going to go ahead and select Foundry Staking as the self-sovereign provider that I choose to deploy my application on. So at this point, I've accepted the bid from that provider, and now we're interacting with the blockchain once again. And now that I've selected a provider, I want to create a lease with that provider. So that lease is based on the pricing. It's a pricing agreement based on the price that is advertised and the amount of specs for that deployment. I'm going to create a lease based on those specs. So I'm going to go ahead and approve that transaction. And now that create lease transaction is being written into the Akash blockchain. At this point in the deployment process, we kind of take a little bit of a fork. And at this point, we're no longer directly interacting with the blockchain, but I've now selected an individual provider. And now I want to have communication directly with that provider. So that SDL that I sent, covered briefly prior, that SDL, the recipe for my deployment, is now being sent to that specific provider. So we now have direct communication between myself as a deployer and that specific Foundry Staking provider because they're who I selected as a provider. For anyone that's familiar with Docker or Kubernetes or DevOps in general, some of this part of the deployment process might look familiar. Where essentially, as I said earlier, we, as those providers are running their own Kubernetes clusters, basically these deployments are containerized images. So if you're familiar with Docker or Kubernetes, you might see that this looking very familiar, where we're creating a container and we're starting and deploying that container onto that specific provider, the Foundry Staking provider. Going further within the Akash console, if you wanted to look at further logs, we can see that based on the fact that this is a React app, we can see that Super Mario React app being spawned on that specific provider. So again, this isn't interaction with the network in general. At this point, this is direct communication between myself as a deployer and that self-sovereign provider that's on the network, which in this case was Foundry Staking. After we have completed this entire process, I described that we were creating a lease on the blockchain, and that lease is a agreement between myself as a deployer and that individual provider. So I described that create lease transaction. Now that that lease exists on the network and the container has been spawned on Foundry Staking, that specific provider, we can look at the lease status. So as you can see, based on the specs that I had in the SDL and the provider that I selected, we now have an active lease. We can see the status of the lease. And because this is a web app, we're also given a URI. So this is a individual unique URI for my application on this specific provider. So you can see in the URI, the foundrystaking.com. So it's a URI generated automatically by the provider. You can also use other mechanisms in this. So obviously this is not a easy to decipher or easy to remember URI, but also when I was creating my SDL, I could have put in a custom domain as well. So along with the auto-generated domain for this web application, I could also give it a custom domain that is obviously easier for users or customers to be able to reach that application. But in this specific example, I didn't specify that in the SDL, so I now have this unique URI, and I just realized that I am only sharing part of my screen, so you wouldn't be able to see this. But if I were to click on this link, you would see that we now have a active Super Mario video game running on the Akash network. And really, in totality, that's kind of the process of deploying applications onto the Akash network. As you can see, if you become familiar with this process, if you do it once or twice, it's a very familiar process using this interface, the Akash console. Also, as I said, if you're more DevOps focused, primarily where I create and launch applications is via the Akash CLI. So you could also, within seconds, once the process becomes a little bit familiar, launch an application out of the Akash network. So within probably 3 commands from the CLI, I can create a deployment that launches the application order onto the network. I look at the providers that have responded. I create the lease. I look at the lease status. And now, obviously, being very familiar with the Akash network as a application developer, I can develop or I can launch a developed application out the Akash network literally within seconds. So you can see the power of, especially when you start to think of like the GPU marketplace and some more sophisticated workloads. Within seconds, I can develop an application, containerize it, and then launch it onto this blockchain, the Akash blockchain, which will then respond with all these different bids from these self-sovereign providers. And then very quickly, I can launch my application onto the Akash network at very affordable prices. Our GPU and CPU prices are typically at a 90% discount over the likes of AWS or GCP or other outlets, especially for GPUs. We have dramatically reduced pricing for GPUs. So as you can see, as you become familiar with these mechanics and launching onto the Akash network, you can launch applications onto this decentralized topology, this decentralized network very quickly and very easily. So with that, I know that was a lot. So anything that I just covered, let me briefly, since I'm sharing this specific tab, I'm going to go to our documentation site. So the Akash network documentation site. So you can reach this by going to Akash network /docs, or if a little easier way to navigate to this is just go to the Akash network general site. And then when you're at this general site, just click on docs. And anything that I just described, if you go to the deployment tab, you can find further information. I just covered the Akash console. Currently in the documentation, this is called CloudMost Deploy. So this is the identical interface that I just demonstrated. In fact, if I went to deploy.cloudmost, this is essentially the identical application. The Overclock Labs team recently acquired CloudMost, so we're going through a rebranding from CloudMost to the Akash console, but it's an identical application. So the only reason I bring that up is if you go to our documentation site and are looking to experiment with the process that I just showed you for application deployment, just click on CloudMost Deploy, and there's very granular documentation on how to launch an application. It gets into further detail about the SDL that I covered for application developers that are looking to maybe not use an awesome Akash ready-to-go template, but need to drill into the mechanics behind the SDL. It will go into a lot of detail in those regards. And then also for those that are more DevOps focused, and as I described, this is typically the path that I would go through. You can also do identical processes by using the Akash CLI. So you could go through an Akash CLI, initially go through the Akash CLI installation, and then it'll talk about how you can create an account and fund your account with AKT, the native token for the Akash network. And then it will go through all the processes that I just showed for creating a deployment, looking at the bids that are are spawned and the providers that respond with bids on the Akash network, creating the lease, sending the SDL or the manifest to the provider, and then checking the URI or the lease details after you've fully created the lease and send the manifest to the selected provider. So I just want to make everyone aware of this documentation. So anything that I covered today, realize could be a lot, but you can certainly go through and experiment with any of this in your own time by using this documentation site. That's we've come a long way with our documentation over the last 2 or 3 years. So at this point, we're pretty confident that this documentation should give you everything that you needed to get started with deploying applications onto the Akash network. And then further, for anyone in the audience that is interested in becoming one of those self-sovereign providers and running your own provider and monetizing some spare compute or some spare GPUs that you may have, you can also go into the provider section and go into building a cloud provider and build your own Akash provider to become part of the network as well. So with that, Trevor, I'm going to stop sharing just so I can come back to the screen. I can definitely reshare if any questions come up, and also just looking at the chat quickly, but anything that you want to call out for any questions that have come up as I was going through.
There we go. Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, thanks for going through all of that for everyone. I think they flagged one question that came up, and it's, are GPUs any harder to deploy?
Are GPUs any harder to deploy?
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. So the process to deploy a workload with a GPU would be identical. So there's a portion in that SDL and the recipe for the Akash deployment where, along with your CPUs and memory and storage, you could also in that spec specify that you want a GPU as part of the workload. And then you can become more granular from there. You could say, not only do I want a GPU, but I specifically want a NVIDIA A100. And even more specific than that, you could even say, as part of this deployment, I want a NVIDIA A100 with a specific amount of memory and a specific interface, like PCIe or a different type of GPU interface. But no, the simple answer to the question is, if you're deploying an application that needs access to GPUs, it's just a matter of including a GPU segment in the SDL.
Gotcha. So no more difficult.
No.
That's good.
No.
I think that was the main question. I don't have anything else on my end. I don't know about you. If not, we can give it a few. There we go. Now they're curious.
Yeah. So to answer those questions, yeah, I can now see them coming in real time as well. So yeah. So the answer to the question, are we locked into the entire month of cost? So no, absolutely not. So to deploy into the Akash network, you don't need to go through any like KYC or any kind. This is an open network and self-custody network. When you create the deployment and you're getting those bids back from a provider, they're giving you monthly cost. So in order to deploy that Super Mario web application, the provider that I selected may have stated that it costs in US dollars. I'll use US dollars to keep it simple. It's going to cost $2.50 to run that application for a month on the Akash network. That's not locking you into running that application for a month. You could run it for 2 hours if you wanted to. And when you close the application, at that point, any funds that are not spent would be returned to your wallet. So if you launched an application, only ran it on the network for like 2 hours, you'll get any remaining funds immediately placed back into your wallet. And obviously, and this is something that I think is going to be very exciting about the Akash network going forward. I think there's a lot of workloads that are that's very powerful. Like if I'm running a AI training model and possibly I need to throw, like 10 A100s at it, we're talking about like very expensive workloads at that point. So it's very attractive for people to be able to come on and possibly do training for, say, 12 hours. So thinking of like kind of like serverless computing and things like that, I think they're going to be a key part of the network's future. And already today, you can do that somewhat through a manual basis of I can just come on, do AI training for like 10 hours. So it's going to be rather expensive for those 10 hours, but I'm only paying for those resources for the exact amount of time that I want, and then I can shut the deployment down as soon as I'm complete.
More questions from the audience. They wait until the end.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's good. So I can just cover them as they come in. So more ways to get involved. So one of the ways to become involved is if you go to that documentation site that I referenced, and you go to the support section, we have a very active and very vibrant Discord server community. So to become involved, and you want to become an Akash provider, but possibly are struggling through parts of the process, you can engage on our Discord community, and either for deployment or provider issues, we've developed over the last couple of years a outstanding community. So some of those are what we call Akash insiders that are very, very knowledgeable individuals. And this now is in numbers in dozens of individuals that are just passionate about the Akash network that are constantly available to help. So one way to engage is on our Discord server. And then also at the beginning of last year, Akash has always been an open source project, but we became what we call radically open source at the beginning of last year. So we now also have a very vibrant community of SIGs, special interest groups, and working groups. We kind of follow the Kubernetes model in these regards. So if you want to go even further and are not only interested in deploying or possibly creating a provider on the Akash network, you want to get in even deeper and talk about the architecture and what's in the pipeline and the roadmap, and possibly contributing to the project yourself, we definitely encourage, and you can find all this information on our documentation site as well, of how to initially become engaged, or from the Akash, actually probably the Akash.network main website is a better place where you can look for active SIGs and working groups. But if you're interested in contributing to the open source project, there's very vibrant communities and discussions monthly. These SIGs and working groups usually meet every couple of weeks or every month, and you can get involved in contributing to the open source project, or just talking and discussing and influencing what's going to be on the roadmap and where you see opportunities and value. So yeah, I would say primarily our Discord server and becoming involved in working groups and SIGs are the best way to become further involved. So I see another question. So I'll just see this while it's on the screen. How are we in terms of plans for lease renegotiation to counter volatility of assets apart from using USDC Tether? So a couple of things in these regards. So over the past year, we introduced the ability to create a lease with USDC Tether, which is part of this question. So instead of creating a lease and putting AKT or native token into escrow, you also have the ability to pay in stablecoin. So that takes away some of the volatility, and as AKT fluctuates, obviously that was one of the main drivers for wanting to be able to pay with stablecoins as well. And then this question, how are we in plans of lease renegotiation? So we think we've solved that primarily through the use of stablecoins and stable payments. But there are also ongoing discussions about even if you pay in AKT, could there be mechanisms to have lease renegotiation based on the volatility of some coins? So basically what I would say in answer to the question is we've come a long way with the introduction of stablecoin payments, but definitely there's not really anything imminent at this point. But we are also looking in the future into the possibility of having lease renegotiation based on fluctuation in AKT. So simple answer, you can pay in stablecoin instead of just AKT. And yeah, there's probably more to come on the horizon in these regards as well.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that for everybody. Seems pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah.
Especially with the stable.
Yeah, this is obviously a huge concern for the volatility of crypto. So
sure. The
fact that you create a lease with a provider and you pay 5 AKT, which is worth $5 today, and then the AKT goes to $30 per AKT, then obviously your lease all of a sudden becomes much more expensive. So one way that you could deal with that manually is obviously if there's been large fluctuations in AKT and you're paying in AKT, you could close the lease and recreate it under the current terms. But that's obviously not an elegant solution. So we, the stable payments is our current mechanism. But yeah, there's probably more to come there as well.
Awesome, good stuff. Well, I think that's everything. I think the audience got a good crack at you.
Okay.
So we can go ahead and tie it up. All finished.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess the only thing that I would finish, I talked about our Discord community.
Sure.
Prior, I'm certainly one of the more active people in those channels as a member of the core team. So if you want to gauge any further, that's certainly probably the most direct means. And this could go anywhere from wanting to contribute to the open source project and having developer questions all the way down to very simple. I'm playing with the deployment for the first time and have some questions or have some struggles. So if you have any other questions for myself or other core team members, certainly reach out to us in Discord.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thanks Scott for taking a deep dive into like what it looks like to deploy on Akash. I'm sure everybody really got a lot out of that. And to all the builders, remember that like if you're interested in like deep in cloud AI, get engaged here. There's 200,000 up for grabs, and I think also you're covering hosting for some of the winners as well. Lots of tracks, lots of opportunities, lots of good workshops. So get engaged. DoraHacks.io, and then also don't forget to check out Akash and the documentation and the Discord. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a good day, everybody.
Yeah, I appreciate it, everyone. Look forward to further engaging during the hackathon. So thanks, guys.